Hello, and welcome to the National Railway Museum podcast. Some of our stories are so detailed and so in depth and just need lots of time to unpack. And the point of this podcast is to give some of those stories the time they deserve while talking about it with an expert. My guest today is someone who a lot of people will be very familiar with. It's Senior Curator Anthony Coulls, who's also my line manager at the moment.
No pressure there.
Is that a P45 in your pocket, or are you just pleased to see me?
No, I think far from it, Ollie, far from it.
Far from it on both counts.
Well, quite so. No, I'm always pleased to see you. Always pleased to see you. And it's a pleasure.
Anthony and I have worked together for 10 years now, which is probably nothing neither of us want to
You were about to
necessarily
say too long, weren't you?
Too long, yes. But one of the things we share a passion for is particularly the weird and wonderful world of the early railways. So we're going to, I think we said before we started filming, anything pre-rocket in 1829, 1830 is fair game.
Absolutely.
And that's my feeling, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah.
I'm just going to start with a really easy question, which is like, how far back does this story go, Anthony?
Well, how far back do you want to go?
You and I disagree on whether, so we're starting with a disagreement.
Because you see, I have my mind open or my brain blown, depending on what you want to think of it, by the eminent railway scholar, Dr. Michael Lewis, MJT Lewis, who wrote a book called Early Wooden Railways back in the 1960s, and it's never been bettered. You know, his research, he's a Cambridge graduate, he's an archaeologist, very, very eminent man, but very interested in early technology. And he did a paper at the very first Early Railways conference in 1998, I think it was, on railways in the classical world, the Greek and Roman world. And I go by Michael Lewis's definition of a railway, which is a railway is a prepared track made in such a way that the vehicles running on it cannot leave the track. So actually that means that if you've got a dishwasher at home, you've got a railway, because the little carriage at the bottom of your dishwasher that rolls out with the plates in doesn't come off that. Apart from you pull it too hard, it comes out. But it's like a narrow gauge railway. It's wheels on a guided way that goes in and out, and that, in Michael Lewis's definition, is a railway. So there are railways going back to the classical world where they are used in a theatre, where they bring props across the stage being pulled on a piece of string, or a candle burns through a bit of rope and the weight of the thing moves a ghost across the stage, or you move an altar in your house to one of your household gods, the god of the rail, god in the, but on a more practical level, the railway in the classical world shows its, perhaps in my view, its most glorious manifestation is the Diolkos in Greece, where you're carrying ships across the Peloponnese. So instead of having to circumnavigate the Peloponnese and go all the way round by sea, you build a stone way across the isthmus, which is about, I suppose, I've never been, but it's about 3.5 miles, something like that. And you put your boat on a wagon, take it across the Diolkos and put it back in the water. And that is a railway. It doesn't have points, it doesn't have systems like that, and it's not a rutway, so the grooves are not worn by use, and I think that's a very significant thing. So people talk about rutways, where the wagons and carts channel through wear in a railway or a wagonway of sorts, but actually the Diolkos is built, it's engineered as a way which these vehicles run on. So, and that runs for hundreds of years, from BC to AD, which is just absolutely monstrous. So, if you want to go back to the classical world, that's where I start. That's if you talk to, ask me, that's where I think railways begin. But you've already said you've got a. You and I disagree.
For those of us who think of something slightly more conventional, like with a vehicle moving on rails that isn't an ancient Greek sailing vessel.
Well, I've never been conventional, have I?
No, you haven't. I mean, that's a good... how far into the... are we talking about the Industrial Revolution in Britain, or are we talking about before the Industrial Revolution? Like, what century are we in for this?
In Britain, we're talking about the late early modern period. Okay. So, railways in terms of wooden wagonways with trucks on, with wheels, come in about the 1560s in Cumbria. So you've got the Company of the Mines Royal, and they're opening silver lead mines in Cumberland, as it then was. You can't say Cumbria, you have to get the local authority boundaries right. I get picked up on that.
Yeah.
I do. I have been picked up about.
We'll get comments below
We will
the
get
video.
comments on that. As Coulls doesn't know what he's talking about.
Cumbrian Liberation Front, and
no,
yeah.
be careful.
Yeah.
Be careful, Ollie. Be very careful with that. But the concept of the railway in that form comes from Europe, and it comes from Germany, Transylvania, wherever, and you have what's called a hunt truck. The concept. So Agricola writes this book De Re Metallica about metal and mining and its processing, and it has images of almost like little gnome figures with the hoods pushing these trucks on wooden planks along in the mines, and that's what you've got in Coldbeck. You've got what they call coffin levels, because they're about the shape of a human, they're wider at the shoulders, and you've got wooden planks along the bottom, wooden rails with sleepers, and then there's a pin that guides everything between. And we've got a model of one of those, a full-size model in Great Hall. So that's, they found, mine explorers have found the remains of these things in Cumbrian mines. So we know they actually existed. But on the surface, it's 1603. It's Huntingdon Beaumont at Strelly near Nottingham. Railway about, I think, 2.5 miles long, horse-drawn on the surface, moving coal from his pits down to the town.
So this is a wooden rail with a carriage that's
Yep.
being guided somehow on the rails, and then a horse is. We're talking about horse propulsion.
Horse propulsion, manumotive as well. Sometimes people pushing the things, and it's all timber. Everything, the whole concept of iron production is, it's still a little bit agricultural, decorative ironwork. You don't use it for everyday purposes, and the wooden railway takes off from 1603. I think Huntingdon Beaumont's line doesn't last that long, but the concept is there, and throughout the 17th and 18th century, the wooden railway develops from those beginnings at Strelly through to the northeast of England, down South Wales, Shropshire. It's like an idea has gone out, and everyone thinks of the northeast of England, but they forget the tramways in South Wales, the wooden wagon ways. They forget about the wagon ways in I've gone and forgotten where now. It's South Wales and Shropshire.
Yeah, so
and
we're
the
talking
northeast.
like your classic early industrial revolution.
You are there,
Coalbrookdale sort of.
All the ingredients are starting to come together in the right place, but it's that whole argument of, is there a pre-industrial revolution, a pre-industrial revolution, because it's all about right things in the right place and the right time, but one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So there's no great moment of revolution in my mind. You call it the Industrial Revolution, but actually it begins before that, because things get into place and allow you. So, for example, the New Common Society recently published a paper where they said, well, actually was... because we're looking at the 1560s, are we talking about a Tudor Industrial Revolution with things beginning to happen, with mining and technology coming in?
And we're collecting some of this. I remember like a few years ago we accessioned some of this, because some of it still survives. Even you said, it's timber and it's it's malleable and these things only last for a couple of years, but sometimes they do survive in the ground.
That's right. And certainly one of the biggest finds for us, or acquisitions for me in the last 20 years, was the Willington Wagonway from the northeast of England, and that's 1770s, 1780s, so it's not particularly early, but it's earlier than anything that we have in the collection. So I mean, just to make sure that again the comments isn't littered with people saying you've forgotten the Tanfield Railway and the Causey Arch in 1725. I mean, we're sitting here recording this right at the end of Railway 200 year, and I think it's a delicious irony that Tanfield Railway have had their own series of events this year celebrating Tanfield 300, very quietly but very sure-footedly. And people like Les Turnbull have revisited and said, well, what actually was the real significance of S&DR? But, we might come on to that in a little bit. But early railways, wooden wagonways, fabulous. I mean, the Willington Wagonway, you say to people wagonway and they think something really quite bucolic and rambling with turf between the tracks and a horse plodding along with a man following on behind. And yet when you look at the maps of the wagonways of the northeast going down to the River Tyne and the River Wear, we are talking industrial arteries. We're talking wagons on some of these ways between 2 minutes and 30 seconds headway between wagons, without email, without phones, without telecommunications, moving masses. And of course they're meeting the ships on a tidal river. And how on earth are they working that out? Absolutely amazing.
And I think one of the things that really strikes me is that by the time you've got, not that I want to sort of bring George Stephenson in yet, but by that sort of 1820s moment, you've got generations of people who've grown up, like multiple generations maybe, seeing this technology, being familiar with it, just understanding that it's there in the landscape. And I'm also thinking about, you were talking about landscape, something like that very famous painting of Coalbrookdale by night, like
de Lauderborg,
like blasted industrial landscapes already, like pre-steam railway.
Well, you are into that wave that industrialization was an invasion upon the landscape, and it was an invasion upon people's social lives and the economic life of the country. You're going from an agrarian society where it's dawn till dusk to where you're governed by the factory bell and then whistle and then hooter as steam power comes in. But what a change that it was. And people, as you know, they were industrial tourists, people doing their own version of the Grand Tour, coming to the UK to see watermills, to see coke ovens, and that spectacle of Coalbrookdale by night. It's really something completely else.
So we're into like a coal economy, decades and decades before. In fact, in some ways, that the railway's the last of the big industrial, that we think of as the classic inventions of the Industrial Revolution. It's the last one. We've got the steam-powered factories, we've got the early steam ships and things like that coming in. The railways are one of the last ones to arrive, I suppose.
This is the whole thing, and it's where it works together as a system, and one thing, as you say, leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So that Wellington wagonway that we talked about, that we have from 1770, 1780, there's been work done on the rails of that, and we think of recycling as a very 21st century thing to do. The Wellington wagonway rails and sleepers are made from recycled ship's timbers.
I mean, this is one of the most amazing things. These things have been in the ground for over 200 years. Somehow they're still there. But somehow still there's fragments of paint. From the original ships, which is
stunning,
just
isn't it?
Like mind blowing that survived for us.
And again, with the origins of it, it's where we get the standard gauge coming from. The 4 feet 8 inches. The ½ inch was added later by Stephenson to give a bit of tolerance on curves, but he didn't really invent it at all. No. It was what the gauge of the rails that they were used to, and we might as well talk Stephenson now. That he's not the first, but he's right there. You and I have been to the cottage at Wylam, and we've seen the route of the wagonway and seen how from that front window he'd have observed the wagon wheels going past from a very, very early age. So, the concept of the railway is ingrained in his psyche.
Do we want to keep going with Stephenson? Or I suppose maybe, do we want to go with Stephenson? Or, I mean, there'll be people already in the comments being like anticipating another name.
What about?
Yeah, there's another name who looked a lot like our dear colleague Thomas, but is not Thomas. It's not Thomas we're thinking of, sadly. It's Richard Trevithick.
Yeah.
Where does Richard Trevithick come into this story?
Trevithick comes in because Trevithick is the man who makes the steam locomotive possible.
Right.
If you think about the steam engine or the atmospheric engine before it, the atmospheric engine comes in 1712 with Thomas Newcomen. It's a variation on Savory and Papin with their steam fire machines for raising water by the force of fire in 1698 and thereafter. And they're using the vacuum. They're using atmospheric pressure. So the steam is there to fill a void. You make a vacuum, and then it uses the power of that to raise water through the beam engine, the atmospheric engine, 1712. James Watt improves on that and makes it a condensing engine and a twin acting cylinder, so you've got steam on both sides of the piston, all that sort of thing. But the beam engine is still a monstrously great thing. It's built into a building. You look at those early mills with the beam engines, and they are, the beam engine is 2-3 floors high,
and it's designed for static use.
Absolutely.
Like it's powering a mine or a factory or a system.
And the pressure on those boilers is between 5 and 12 pounds per square inch. And we've talked in Curator with a camera about what pressure is. It's like that square inch, and it's like 12 pounds of weight pushing on it as a force. And that's very good for working a pumping engine or a engine driving a polishing machine, like the lap engine that we have at South Kensington in the Science Museum. Old Bess, all of those things in the power hall, and to a certain extent some of the stationary engines and the early engines in the collection at Manchester. But there is a feeling amongst people that you can do something else with this steam power. You use the expansive power of the pressure itself to make a force. So it actually, it's before Trevithick. We have our man William Murdoch, who comes down from Scotland to go and develop all sorts of things, and he creates a steam carriage. It's only about so long. It's in the collection of Birmingham Museum, and he makes it, and it's got 3 wheels and a cylinder and a little boiler powered by a spirit lamp, and it goes trundling off down the street. I think it's Red Ruth he ran it at. And the vicar came across it the other way and thought it was the devil of hell come to claim him because it was spitting fire and hissing at
coming
him.
Down the street at night.
And James Watt, who's Murdoch's boss, basically says, stop messing around with that. Stop it. Go and do something useful instead. So Murdoch goes off and invents gaslighting.
Yeah.
Great. Don't be so silly.
As you
do something useful.
Yeah.
But he makes a steam carriage. Now, of course, that's in the UK. In France, we had Monsieur Cuneau make his Fardier, which was, again, a steam road carriage, a gun carriage, involved in the first road traffic accident when he knocked a wall down with it. I love the spirit of some of these early pioneers, because they've got that courage to fail.
And when you go into our collection, there's so many images, I think, of the weird and wonderful, visions of you've done in sort of the 1810s, and what Hyde Park will look like in 30 years.
Yeah, and there's all smoke and chimneys and wheels and everything. But just going back to Trevithick, so Trevithick, he's not the first person to make a steam carriage, but he is the first person to realise that if you constrain this power of steam and increases its pressure, it's a more powerful thing, and you can then miniaturise and compact your engine. So he goes to Coalbrookdale to create, to build high pressure engines and boilers, and he shows Abraham Darby this high pressure boiler, and Darby's like absolutely scared witless by this thing that's running at about £50 per square inch. James Watt sort of says, he should be cast into hell because he's so dangerous. But Trevithick, he's brilliant. He's got this inventive mind that says, I'm going to have a go anyway. And perhaps that's his bit of Cornish blood in him there that says, let's have a go at this. He comes from Cornish mining background.
He's quite a larger than life
very
character.
Much so,
6'5", 6'6". There's a story about the hammer.
Yeah, throwing the hammer over the church.
Whether this is true or through all the way over the top of the church.
But as somebody with Cornish blood in him, because that's what my surname comes from, Cornwall. I have to feel a certain affinity with my fellow countrymen, and but Trevithick, with these small stationary engines that he makes, they're much smaller. They'll fit in a room. They'd fit in a carriage like this, and you can suddenly have a much more powerful engine in a much smaller space. And it's only a matter of time before he says, let's stick this on wheels. So 1801, he makes what's called the Puffing Devil and runs it through Camborne. Must have had, the land speed record of the time as it goes along
this
snorting.
Is on the road?
Yeah. So we hadn't put it on railways at the time, so there's no railway engine. But he proves the concept that you can have a steam road or a steam locomotive, a steam road locomotive, and off it goes. And they think, this is great. And so he retires with his mates into the pub for a goose dinner, forgets about the engine outside, it goes bang. It's once again learning lessons from the power of steam, a little bit destructively. But he then goes on to make small model engines. We have one of them in our collection again at South Kensington, and some of those other early Trevithick engines survive in other museums, which is amazing. And we have also one of his stationary engines and an engine that is very similar to what his Catch Me You Can might have been. But I jump forward a wee bit. The whole concept of building a railway locomotive is only a matter of time away, and people are starting to experiment with cast iron rails, because they know that wooden rails wear out quite
just
quickly.
Can't take the sheer weight of this cast iron vehicle.
And so they try putting iron plates on top of the wooden rails. That still doesn't work very well, so let's make cast iron rails themselves. And the cast iron rails don't like the shock. But so 1803, he's in Shropshire, and there was a suggestion for a time that he built a locomotive in Shropshire, steam locomotive, and recent research has proven that it was certainly talked about, but it probably didn't happen. But we know that February 1804, he answered the bet with Davies Giddy and said, about let's build an engine, a locomotive that will run and carry the coals on the Penydarren tram road down to the wharf.
And this is a bet between two landowners or industrialists, or
it's between Trevithick and the industrialists.
Between the Trevithick and the
Let's
industrialists.
do this.
Yeah.
Let's do this. So 1803, there's the idea that he builds this locomotive for Shropshire, which has been proven it most likely didn't exist. It's been thrown by the existence of a very early drawing that we have in our collection by Llewellyn, which shows an engine to about 3 foot gauge, which is smaller than you'd expect for the Penydarren tramroad engine. But of course, that's where it all comes in, doesn't it? With that bet between the ironmasters that they can't have this thing that will pull a train of trams along the Merthyr tramroad, the Penydarren tramway. Yeah. And there it does. Trevithick builds a travelling locomotive engine that runs on the rails, comes off a couple of times, has to stop for water, but
it's like a proof of concept.
It does, and as you know, the amazing thing is the transfer of technology. So 1805, the following year, the first locomotive is built in Gateshead, to a Trevithick pattern and demonstrated, but as we've just said, the rails were not up to it. But the thing that's really important there is who saw it. It was on Tyneside, which is not a million miles from Wylam. It's not a million miles from the Durham coalfield. And everybody, whether we've got a record or not of it, you can bet your bottom dollar they went to see it. Yeah. And the concept of the steam locomotive entered the engineering mind of the northeast of England, whether it worked or not.
I think it's a really interesting point, because we're so used to, I think, in the 21st century, people being very proprietorial about technology and, developing things in secret. Yeah. R&D being a thing that happens, behind closed doors, and then products are unveiled. Lots of copyright being enforced.
Industrial espionage.
But we're talking, this is a time where people could be both collaborators and competitors at the same time.
Very much so.
It's very common to go up and look at your potential business rival's thing.
You think about running back to Bolton and Watt and the Soho manufactory in Birmingham and the Lunar Society with, and it's not lunatic because they're lunatics as such, but that's where the name comes from. They went and met and discussed the scientific and technical and industrial ideas of the day, because they met on a night when it was the full moon, so they could go to the factory to go and chat, or the Soho House and go and chat there, and they were lunatics. But those are people of a real inquiring mind, bouncing ideas off each other. And you're exactly right. That crucible of engineering knowledge, experience and inquiring nature is such a hotbed in those first 20 years of the 19th century. It's amazing. We know about some of the figures, but I bet you there were a heck of a lot more.
I feel like I want to pause the chronology here. Because we've brought up lunatics, and absolutely take your point that they are the unfortunately
so back to
named
Mr.
Lunar
Trevithick.
Society. Well, no, I was thinking, do we want to, because some of these, and you talked about the confusion about that 1803. Did we know? Did we not? There's a drawing in the collection. A lot of these things only survive because there's a drawing, or how common was it for these things to explode?
Well, I mean, it's like any piece of technology. Safety comes in through mishaps. Whether it's signalling on the mainline railway or the safety valve on a steam locomotive. There is always, tragedy goes ahead of a triumph, and therefore this must never happen again. So safety things come up. But one of the engines that we could talk about, 1813, William Brunton, an engineer down from Scotland. He's with the Butterley Company in Derbyshire, and he wishes to create a steam locomotive, but it's not a steam locomotive like you or I know, is it?
No.
It is
it's Brunton's mechanical steam horse.
Absolutely, his travelling engine.
It's travelling engine. It's really going places. spoiler, the places are into lots of bits along with several crew and bystanders when it inevitably explodes. But this is, I mean, if you can imagine one of these early rails, but with legs.
Yes.
Pistoning legs at the back, which looks like something that's crawled out of your sort of nightmares, isn't it?
And it is. You look at those drawings of it, you put eyes on it, and it...
Oh, it could be horrifying.
And
people were very busy putting and animating
caricatures,
engines,
didn't you?
dragons and demons
These engines with fearsome eyes and great teeth and mouths. You know, I come to die and I come to sup. I come to eat you up. Is one of the cartoons I always remember. It's the railway
overturning
juggernaut.
the table.
Yeah, that's the one.
It's my favourite because there's a man who's very, very like early 19th century. Oh my babies! Oh my beef! Oh my baby! That's the priority order of like late Georgian like father is dinner first, children maybe a second.
Yes, the arrival of the railway juggernaut. I think it was, wasn't it?
But, and there's loads of those, isn't there? Sort of animating these.
But
things.
Back to Brunton. You know, the first steam horse works down at Claycross in Derbyshire, so it's just 3 miles an hour. So it's not gonna break any records, unlike Trevithick. And it didn't break the rails either.
No.
But they were trying because they didn't know about adhesion of steel or iron wheels gripping iron rails, so it had those feet. But buoyed on by that success, he sold one, didn't he, to New Bottle Colliery, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
And so up in the Durham coalfields, right into Stevenson and Headley and territory. Yeah. And he's got this steam horse. And, well, what happens on its first outing? Yeah. Bang.
Yeah. But, I mean, I remember when you did your exhibition on railway models. Is it the piddler? Or
the dribbler.
The dribbler.
Or the piddler.
What is it? What is a dribbler, and why don't I want it on my carpet?
Well, you don't want it on your carpet because it'll either set fire to it or pour oily water all over it, and much to the vexation of the maid, I think was the phrase at the time. But,
but this is a model, not a full.
Yeah, they were a bit later than our time, but the first models were being made to prove concepts around that time, 1800. Trevithick's first models are there in the Science Museum and in the Guinness collection in Ireland. Beautiful things to prove a concept before you go ahead and make the thing large.
So we have to come back to Trevithick, I think, because otherwise people will be. I can feel people
back in those comments section.
Yeah, back in the comments section. But get it back to Trevithick.
Does this happen on the rest is history? Do you suppose? Do they get
I don't know. We'll have to find out.
Other podcasts are available.
As were other engines. So, I mean, this is the thing. Everything is to play for. Yeah. The concept is out there, but nothing's set down yet.
No.
Are we in Catch Me Who Can? Territory?
Yeah. Well,
should we talk about that?
Well, yeah, because that's pretty much the end of Trevithick's dalliance with the railway locomotive. He's a superb engineer, but he's not a businessman at all. And we can talk a little bit about his later life and the chance encounter in South America, which is amazing. Yeah. But 1808. We've talked about not the first steam passenger railway. Well, I think 1808, Catch Me Who Can was.
We could, yeah.
And Catch Me Who Can was Trevithick's locomotive that was built to run on a circular railway, not a million miles from the Euston Road now. You can go and see a blue plaque on the wall on the side of the college where it ran. And they think they may well have found clinker during digs in the past as to where the engine operated. It ran on a circular line and people went and paid money, pretty much as a fairground ride would be now. But
also you're there, I mean, it's got a serious point as well, in that he's trying to attract an investor.
Oh, yes.
This thing can go, it can keep going, it's not going to
You can carry people behind it rather than just coal or goods.
Yeah.
So, he's developing, he's looking at the railway locomotive at the same time as he's looking to develop, or just before he develops road steam carriages, but that's another story. But
we don't have that all we have of that are a handful of sort of lithographic prints.
Yeah.
Our colleague John Liffen down at the Science has spent many years debunking research into.
That's right, and there's those incredible Nats drawings, J.C. Nats drawing of the boiler itself in the gardens after it's been abandoned. We had the thought for the time that the Hazeldine engine at South Kensington might be the remains of Catch Me Who Can, and we know it isn't now, but it was a great story to go down and research at the time.
And so many of these things that they run, they don't attract an investor, or they break down, or the the colliery stops, being profitable, and the thing is abandoned. And then because these things are so valuable, they're repurposed into stationary engines and things on ships, or dredging engines and things like that. Anywhere you might be using a steam engine.
Yes, because a small Trevithick engine, potentially Catch Me Who Can, was used to be a keel hauler and dredging in a vessel, in a boat, and actually that proves the point in a different way of the transfer of technology, of portable steam power. Actually doesn't matter whether it's on the road or the rails or in a vessel. It's being the harbinger of a new age of engineering and mechanical marvels, because look, we can do this, and it doesn't make the boat sink. It's amazing.
So Catch Me Who Can fails to attract investors, is ultimately sold and broken up and recycled into something we don't quite know.
Yeah, possibly a stationary engine. Yeah.
What's the end? I feel like we have to do the end of the Trevithick story before we move on.
Yeah, Trevithick basically loses heart, and he's like, well, I go back to my roots. I'm a miner. I'm an engineer, and he's off to South America. This is the land of not quite milk and honey, but there's all sorts. He's lured by the prospects of mineral wealth. Which, of course, there's that wonderful story of the crocodile.
So this is this weird story where Trevithick's in what's now Panama, which was a different country at the time, and is involved in this scheme where essentially building almost literally where the Panama Canal is now. This idea of, well, you don't need a canal. You just have a railway, so you bring the ships into one side, rail the goods across the very small. I mean, we're back to isthmuses, and then load them onto ships on the other side. How they're going to quite arrange these ships to coincide, I don't think they've really thought about. But there's this bit where he's wandering around. There's been a coup d'état, so he's also around with another engineer and the son of the deposed president of Panama, who's about 12 years old.
You couldn't make it up.
And then there's this bit where they're attacked and almost eaten by a crocodile. And then he bumps into, we keep coming, all roads lead back to Stevenson. He bumps into Stevenson.
Robert
Stevenson in a bar. In Belize, is it?
That's right.
Yeah, in British Belize.
British Belize. And Stevenson sort of hears this accent, which he recognises, and it's the penniless Trevithick, who is pretty much destitute. He's down on his heel, and he doesn't know what to do. And Stevenson, we talked about that industrial espionage and the friendship and the rivalry. Stevenson pays for his passage back to Britain, which, that's an incredibly generous thing to do.
But also famously we never know how true it is, but in the sort of biographies and things have been written, famously this idea they had nothing to talk about. They had nothing in common.
Whereas
thing.
I think
probably
there's a certain amount of the old hagiography in there, isn't there? And I think Smiles probably comes into a large dose of that. Because you just wouldn't be thousands of miles from home and not
have nothing
things.
in common with this man.
No, absolutely not. No, and but again, you see that difference between the two men. Though it's quite possible that conversation was awkward because Trevithick is that tough engineer, hard man, whereas Robert's educated. Robert's been to school. He knows how to speak.
Deliberately sent to school.
Absolutely,
for this,
because
by
of
his father.
So I think there might have been a bit of awkwardness, but then several thousand miles away from home, there you are. And the story of Trevithick is quite sad, really, because even once he was back in the UK, he was a broken man, and he was yesterday's man in many ways, and he died in Dartford penniless. Which is a great shame. But I think, from my point of view of how we celebrate people, I think it's still lovely how in Camborne in Cornwall they have Trevithick Day every year at the end of April, and there is a parade through the streets. It's led by school children and marching bands and steam road engines, and each time they either, as they pass the statue of Captain Dick, they either doff their cap or blow their whistles. I think that's a lovely, lovely thing to do.
It's one of those twists of fate as well, isn't it? If he just, met the right person or had the right moment, it could have been Trevithick. If he'd
had a backer or a business venture who said, "No, I want to get behind you." There was a book written, "The Oblivion of Mr. Trevithick." Almost looking at how history has, and we've had it in our comments where we've talked about things, and people have said, "Oh, you ignore Trevithick." We've had it on Facebook. We've had it all over saying NRM doesn't do anything about Trevithick. Well, actually, we do, and we will do more. Because in terms of railway engineering, as our former colleague Bob Gwynn would say, the names you need to know and they're all available on Curator with a Camera, are Trevithick,
Yeah.
Stevenson and Wickens. Wickens is a wee bit out of our time now with the APT,
think-
but those are the three names of railway engineering that people need to know.
Yeah. I would like to interject another
Please
name
do.
because I think I've got a couple of names that I want, and you have opinions on these, but the one that I had no idea about before coming into the museum, and who sort of fascinates me. I've called him before the fifth Beatle of railway history, because he's sort of almost there.
Yeah.
It's Jonathan Rastrick.
Yes,
So like,
very
who
much
is
so.
because he's threaded through our collections in such a prominent way, but he's someone that has no presence in the sort of even enthusiasts.
This is one of those names, as you quite rightly say, of where he touches, and we don't really know everybody who was around and everybody who saw, but Rastrick is, he's from the northeast of England, but he is another engineer. He's there doing things, looking at things, trying out steam engine technology, working out what goes best and whatever. But he's somebody who then, he feeds into the northeast, but then strikes out on his own and creates his own business, which locates down to Stourbridge.
Yeah.
And the Rastrick foundry still exists as part of a health centre. It's amazing. The actual building is still there on the outside, and they've gone and built a new health centre within it, so they kept the factory.
Amazing.
But Rastrick is a groundbreaker in many ways, because he's not seeking publicity. He's not shouting about winning competitions. He's about just getting on with it and building steam engines. So when the time comes, because he's got a business already doing it, established, when the time comes for the Rainhill Trials to seek judges, he's somebody they look to, because he's already there. He's experienced with locomotives. He's experienced in building locomotives. So 1829, his foundry's most famous products, Foster Rastrick and Company, which was the business by then. Yeah. And Foster is another name that we won't necessarily go to today, but yeah. Foster Rastrick and Company builds two locomotives. One, it's a black engine that we have in our collection here called the Aganoria, and it is one of those few names where we so often in railway history tell people off for using the definitive article. It's not the Duchess of Hamilton, it's not the 910, it's 910 or Flying Scotsman or Duchess of Hamilton. The name on the wheels of Aganoria, and the nameplate is cast onto the wheels. It's the Aganoria.
And this could potentially be the first locomotive nameplate,
I think
potentially.
It quite probably
definitely
is,
one
actually.
of the earliest still extant ones
extant,
that we have.
definitely. But so there's the Aganoria, which is made for local railway down in Stourbridge, and it's there for moving coal, the Pensnet Railway, and it's moving coal from the mine to the canal. Very, steady away. Really interesting engine, a bit like a pair of beam engines side by side on a high pressure boiler. And the other locomotive that he makes that year is the Stourbridge Lion, and the Stourbridge Lion is the first steam locomotive to be exported to the good old US of A, and it has a lion painted on the front end of it, and it must have looked amazing when it arrived in the States, and there's bits of that still survive.
Because one of the things that I want to do with Rastrick is talk about. We've just come out of Railway 200, and Railway 200 has been very, very, in a lovely way, been a real celebration of Britain's railway heritage.
Very much so.
But it's a slight, like, if you're someone who knows about the early rails, it's a little bit odd, because there's no guarantee it was going to be Britain necessarily. No. That was, because there are other people and other countries, and the name that is it. Do we want to talk about Mark Sagan?
We can talk about whoever you like, really, because as I say, the technology of the railway is worldwide by then. It's not even just Europe. There's an incredible thing that when I was doing some research for one of the early railways conferences, and I did a paper on the potential for the first railway in Sierra Leone, West Africa, a country, as you know, quite dear to my heart, in 1821. They survey for a small railway moving provisions in 1821.
And this is like a naval project.
Yeah, it's a naval project, but that's in West Africa. Yeah. We could have had a railway in Germany. We could have had steam railways wherever, because the steam engine technology is. People are coming from all over to see this, and some of the accounts are well known, and others less so. But in a world where there's no faxes, there's no emails, there's no telephones, it's going like wildfire, isn't it? And as you say, Marc Séguin in France, let's build a steam engine, steam locomotive.
And it's quite an unusual one because it does it's almost like Rocket. He's almost there, but it's almost the reverse action. Could you explain that?
Yeah, well,
I'm not even going to pretend
No.
understand that.
Marc Séguin's locomotive, they knew by then that they wanted to make the steam locomotive efficient. And that was the real challenge of it, is getting the most out of the fuel that you can.
Because as you know, sorry, but like, for people who, like me, are not locomotive experts, Aginora is almost like a kettle, in terms of like, it's one big tank of water, you're heating all of that up. It's really slow.
Yeah, it's
as
quite
you can
inefficient.
imagine heating like a huge bath with a fire would be.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
Like, how do we bring this thing up to steam? That's a challenge.
Yeah.
So sorry, Séguin.
No, so one of the ways you do that is increase the amount of metal that's in contact with the hot gases from the fire, which can either be make a return flue boiler like you see on Puffing Billy and Royal George and other engines throughout that period. Another way is to make lots of different tubes going through, which it really increases that heating area. And Séguin does exactly that. He has a rail-mounted fan in like what looks like a wooden shed attached to the engine to blow air through. So it makes the fire burn hotter. You put more oxygen in, the fire burns more hotter, makes more steam, makes your engine more efficient. And Marc Séguin's locomotive, the multitubular boiler, it's part of those ingredients that go to make the world-beating Rocket. So I know we're jumping ahead of ourselves here, but Rocket's not the first engine to have the various features that made it a world beater, but it's the first locomotive to combine those features together. So we talked about people taking ideas from each other, and we could always... Well, we won't get into the argument of the blast pipe because that would take an entire week of podcasts with that. But
people can write in and say if they want a whole episode of the podcast dedicated to the
blast pipe,
the injustice or not of Timothy Hackworth and the blast pipe and Stevenson, we can do that. Personally, I think both of us might rather not do that. but we can do.
But that whole concept of people saying, that's a great idea. Oh, let's try that. Séguin, it's international. So Séguin's idea in France, the multitubular boiler, is picked up by Henry Booth, and Henry Booth then says to Stevenson, hey, you ought to put this together. Henry Booth, of course, being one of the other luminaries of early locomotives and the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. But as we're stopping at Rocket, let's not go there. We've got an entire 5 years before Liverpool and Manchester 200. That'll date this podcast quite quickly.
Very much, won't it? We might still be here by then. Who knows?
Well, especially if we get onto the blast pipe.
Goodness.
But back to the early locos.
I mean, are there other examples? Because there's someone in my mind sort of coming down the tracks that I want to talk about, but he comes in at the end. Are there other engineers that you want to sort of or places or
there's
stories?
There's so many because, again, to keep it out of the comments section, the first commercial use of steam locomotives on a railway is Middleton.
Yes.
1812, Blenkinsop, Murray.
And this is with the toothed
third
wheel.
It is, because they don't know about adhesion of metal wheels gripping on metal rails. They think that won't work. So it needs to have a way of, as you say, gripping. So you have a cogwheel on one side of the track, and away it goes. Brilliant. Yeah. It works. The Middleton Railway, steam railway with steam locomotives. Okay, it's got a cogwheel on one side, but it does the job.
It's one of those bits that we have some of that cog track in the collection. It's one of those things that people sort of look at and keep walking past in the collection, and it's one of those really important
very much
attempts and ideas, and a bit like we're really into, for people, we're really into like VHS and Betamax territory, and past not taken, aren't we? And not necessarily not taken because they were the worst idea.
No,
either. Or because they weren't commercially. They just didn't land. The chips could have landed a different way.
They nearly did, because the Blenkinsop locomotive proved its capability on the Middleton Railway. So they talk about building them for the Kenton and Cox Lodge in Tyneside, which is where the patterns for our wheels initially come from, and Blenkinsop locomotives in Germany. There's only 3 potential applications of it, but 3 is more than none. It's more than poor old Trevithick ever managed.
I was going to say, yeah.
So you get that, and then around a similar time is our friend Mr. Brunton with his steam horse, and equally injurious to health, because we have an occasion that a Middleton engine blows up.
Yeah.
The guy holds down the safety valve because he wants more power, and I think there's this wonderful phrase in the inquiry where the engine starts to shake and rumble, and they know something's, and witness said it was a shame to see it so.
But this is so common as well, and this feeds back into those anxieties about the locomotive as the devil, as the dragon, as the demon. Best Friend of Charleston, which is one of the first all-American locomotives, as opposed to something like Starbridge Line, which comes over. That has a high-pressure explosion in 1831, I think.
That's right. Yeah.
Kills its fireman, who is... I mean, we'll never know his name, unfortunately, but is almost certainly an enslaved African-American person.
Yeah, amazing story. But...
Yeah, it's such a tragedy, we'll never know that name, but, one of the first casualties is actually an enslaved person working on the railways there. But this is so... incredibly common accidents, derailments, explosions,
and it's also that other thing of, it sounds a terrible thing to say, is the value placed on human life. It's sort of, if you're of a certain class and you work on the railway, we know other people were run over by wooden wagons. They lost their legs to them, they were squashed, they fell off them, and it's actually a new hazard, full stop. And that's because there's never been a level crossing before the railway comes in. And why do I have to get out of the way of this thing? Splat. Oh, the engine doesn't say sorry.
No, it doesn't. No, and we can talk. We're not going to get into it because it's Rocket, and I'm sure we'll do a whole Rocket one. Rocket and running over MPs is its own story.
But yes, I mean, just going back to the steam locomotive becoming a working proposition. The fact that Blenkinsop got it 95% right then drives on William Headley, George Stevenson and the team up in Wylam to say, right, okay, we can... And we have Headley's carriage in the collection as well, the little wooden trial carriage that proves that 4 wheels coupled together can put down power on rails. So then you mount the Blenkinsop engine on top of that, and you've got Puffing Billy. Yeah. You've got Wylam Dilly. You've got the first successful adhesion steam locomotives, which then a couple of years later Stevenson perfects, or doesn't perfect, but begins to develop his own type of engine, like Killingworth Billy, Blucher and My Lord, all those series of engines. And then that's the catalyst that we probably will never know exactly how many steam locomotives were built in the UK between 1812 and 1825, but my colleagues such as Jim Rees, the late Andy Guy, Michael Lewis, Michael Bailey, various people, we reckon that conservatively there's probably pushing on a couple of hundred. Yeah. But they were machines to do a job. Yeah. So, and they don't.
And we're lucky if any bits of them survive. We're lucky if we have drawings.
Yeah, or even an anecdotal in
discussion
newspaper.
In a newspaper.
Absolutely. Yeah. So even now there are. If you go through British newspapers online, I've got a friend at the moment doing a bit of research on it, and he sent me a thing about a road locomotive, ironically, from 1826. And he said, "Have you ever heard of this?" And I said, "No." He said, "Neither have I." And it's not reported in the Engineer. It's not reported in any of the journals. It's not in some of the history journals, such as the New Common Society or any of the railway history societies. Nobody knows about this, so he's off down a rabbit hole as of 2 weeks ago. It's great.
I think this is one of the things, it's so hard to get this is why we're doing it as a podcast, and it wasn't part of Railway 200, and it's such an evolving story.
Yeah,
I think
you can't do
200
this
years ago
with a camera.
No, you can't.
No.
But
that's great fun looking at particular objects, but the early railway as a concept is just massive.
I feel like we have to arrive at the Rainhill Trials at this point, because it is a competition.
Yeah.
It's a competition to prove that locomotives can do the right thing. I'm looking at you. You're nodding, thankfully. I'm not. Andrew's not about to appear and discipline me. But I'm thinking, but also about this versus a rope-hauled railway. Yeah. On which be a steam-driven pulley system.
That's right.
Which doesn't need a moving locomotive. who are the other entries? We've got Rocket. People know about Stephenson's Rocket.
Yeah.
Who are the other 4 entries, and
Well, I think
what are they? How do they get there?
It's maybe good just to recap a little bit more of the precursors to the trials, because as you quite rightly said about the idea that locomotives can't necessarily run a mainline railway, they can't climb hills, the haulage engines, there is correspondence between Robert Stephenson, Nicholas Wood, another name, and others about the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Timothy Hackworth. Timothy Hackworth, by 1827, is the locomotive superintendent of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and he's looking to improve on Stephenson's engines and make efficiencies with them, build bigger versions. His Royal George of 1827, the first 6-wheeled steam locomotive. He's probably running the largest fleet of steam locomotives in the world. Yeah. So he's an expert. You've got Rastrick building them, brilliant. You've got Stephenson building them, brilliant. But the person who's running the big fleet is Hackworth. And there are some really quite entertaining letters between Stephenson as the engineer and of the L&M and Hackworth sort of saying, and Stephenson always despairing, saying, this railway's going to get tied up in its own ropes, and that's where the concept of having a trial to say, well, actually, can steam locomotives do it? Yeah. Can they perform on a multi-mile mainline railway? They knew by then that they could womble up and down between Shildon and Stockton quite happily. But could they go between 2 major towns on a common carrying public railway? And, with the incline in and out of Edge Hill, well, you had to have an incline there. But could the railway be engineered to run with steam locomotives? Well, that's where the scene was set for the Rainhill Trials. Come one, come all. Show us what you can do, because it was a contest of power.
Okay.
Whether it was steam powered or otherwise, it's a contest of locomotives.
Because people often I think because we're so used to, I imagine it as a race.
Yeah.
But it's not about speed. It's about
it was
power,
a bit about speed, but it was about efficiency. It was effectiveness. There were a great stream of conditions that had to be met, so the locomotive, if it was a steam engine, had to consume its own smoke. So they were coke-fired, so you didn't get clouds of smoke from them. They had to weigh a certain amount. They had to, they had to perform over a set distance. The coke would be measured. The amount of water they used would be measured. Yes, the speed would be measured. The weight of train, all that sort of stuff. There were so many variables, and it's where. It's wonderful that our friend John Urquhart Rastrick was one of the judges, because he made copious notes.
And we have that notebook in the collection. And
it's one of our treasures, isn't it? It really is a marvellous thing to see that this guy, actually, how he had the time as a judge to not only get all the dimensions down, but sketch it and write about each of the entrants. Really blows my mind, really, as somebody who's quite thick and struggle to write things down in a hurry. But you look at the technical know-how this guy had, and he's assessing all these engines. It's stunning.
He sort of picked Rocket as the winner almost before the competition happens, hasn't he? We've got that. We often use it as the sketch of the multitubular boiler.
Because it was
under
such
the
a
hood,
groundbreaking
having a look
thing.
at it.
Yeah. Sort of little bit of, let's have a look under the cover of darkness, get a bit of a peek.
But it's also not so groundbreaking that he has no idea what he's looking at. As you say, it's this sort of technologies that are coming. Well,
this is it, and you've also got Stephenson building engines like Lancashire Witch, and that has the directly connected cylinders at an angle as Rocket does, but of course it's too heavy, so it's not taken part in Rainhill Trials. And we've got this wonderful letter that's just been acquired for the collection this week. It came in this morning, which is I'm really quite excited about it. But it talks about the development of Lancashire Witch and some of the technological advances which then made their way onto Rocket, which made Rocket such an effective and efficient machine. But we keep saying it, we jump ahead. We were going to talk about the different runners and riders, weren't we?
We've got you've already queued up one of our competitors, because you've queued up Hackworth. Hackworth is there with his own talking about, you're back to this thing about collaborators and rivals and competitors. He's there with his own engine, and it's some
Samurai, without equal. But Hackworth has to make it in his own time, because he is contracted to the Stockton and Darlington Railway for his professional time. But he does have an agreement that they allow him to build this locomotive. And what he basically creates is his Royal George is a really successful engine. It's a 060 six-wheeled engine, pretty much the precursor to every six-wheeled tender engine for the next 150 years.
Yeah.
Pretty much. And so he's like, that's a really successful loco. So he makes a four-wheel version, which is sans pareil. And he's very proud of it. You know, it's painted green and yellow. It is his pride. And it's built in a rush, though, for him, because he's trying to fit it alongside his day job. And he only manages one sort of midnight trip from Shildon to Hyington with it, just to prove that it works before it has to be shipped off to Liverpool to take part in the trials. So it's tested but not fully proven. We can come back to its performance fairly shortly, but you know, it's there as one of the favourites. Certainly, you know, it's got a tender like Rocket has, because the tenders were all made. If they had a tender, they were all the same type of tender. So you've got the two there. You've got Rocket, and we have sans pareil. The other main runner we have looks completely unlike these others. It was known as
it's a cafetiere on a cart, isn't it? That's what it looks like in the pictures. That's
actually a brilliant way of putting it. It was known as the London engine, and it was Braithwaite and Ericsson, and they built the Novelty, which was light and fast. It did look like a T-urn on wheels. It was copper and blue, and it went like stink. It was really fast. And to the punters, if you want to call that, because people did place bets on these engines.
Huge amounts of money changing hands.
Yeah, and there were crowds came, weren't there? You know, grandstands.
And souvenir. In fact, we've got some of the souvenirs in the collection of people that's just wandering around selling knockoff souvenirs of things.
You couldn't even call it heritat then.
No, just current tat.
People seeing opportunities, weren't they? But you know, Novelty won the hearts of people because it dashed around and it was really fast.
And they're so young. They're 21 and 23. Braithwaite's British, Ericsson is Swedish, and it goes on. If people are of a sort of military history mind, the famous ironclad Monitor in the American Civil War, 40 odd years later, he's the designer of that.
Yes.
But back they are, and Robert Stevenson's there. He's what, barely 18, I think, on the footplate of Rocket as well. So we're talking about lots of young men as well.
Yeah, this isn't grumpy old grey-haired chaps going, this is real cutting-edge technology stuff.
And then we've got two non-runners.
The two.
One of my favourites, which is a horse on a treadmill. What's the horse on the treadmill doing there?
Well, that's Cycloped. And I can't remember the guy that built it.
Brandreth?
That's right, Brandreth, not Giles.
No, I keep that in one of the jumpers.
That's right. That's And I mean, Cycloped is really a non-runner, although it did actually move, but it was pretty
sort of prove a point, I think, isn't it? Like, it's a sort of argument with the judges about
locomotive engines. They don't have to be steam.
They don't have to be steam.
But in many ways, it was an evolutionary dead end, which was a great shame for Brandreth, but it did prove a concept. And then the other one is terribly unfortunate. Was Perseverance, and the unfortunate name Timothy Burstall. Mercifully, it didn't burst, but if I remember rightly, it fell off the carriage on delivery and was broken. And
so it doesn't actually. People always forget it because it doesn't compete.
That's right.
There's a wonderful, I think it was Polish book that I was, the perils of. I know whether it's the perils of Google Translate or the perils of how information was being passed around at the time. It's a Polish book talking about the Rainhill Trials in the 19th century, and it cast Cycloped, this horse and treadmill. Actually, it has this idea that it was like a whole wooden steam engine that had been built to, secretly it had a horse inside, which I think would have just been wonderful. It's a real shame that wasn't true. Suddenly, like, the judging happens and suddenly all the sides fall off and reveal it's a horse. Sadly, that's not what's happening.
No.
So you've got three real
runners and riders, as it were, and so Novelty is run up, and it's doing high 20s, 25, 30 miles an hour, but George Stephenson very famously said it's got near guts, so they put a load behind it, and it's not really up to.
Yeah.
But it didn't stop Liverpool and Manchester Railway buying a couple of
No.
Braithwaite and Ericsson engines, of course, which again are on some of those souvenir pots that we have, the china. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead to the ultimate.
Well, I think we can go to the results. We've
Yeah.
got our competitors.
Yeah.
People know that Rocket ultimately triumphs.
Yeah.
And
But it could have
yeah.
been a close run thing because, in another world, Samparai was too heavy, basically. That was its real problem. And it was... People talk about this whole crazy idea that Stevenson sabotaged it. Well, he didn't, when those engines were built, you went to one place for your steam cylinders.
Yeah.
And there was a flaw in it. And Hackworth chose the 2 cylinders that were fitted to the engine. He didn't know they were flawed either. And it was only under steam under the trial that the flaw showed up. The engine used more steam, used more water, dropped its fusible safety plug in the firebox. Game over, basically.
I think people forget how early this is as well.
Yeah.
We're talking so much pre, forget diagnostics, forget any of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I always think the really one that sticks in my mind is Stephenson's early engine, which is Blücher.
Yeah.
Named after the Prussian general at Waterloo.
Yeah.
And we're still, we're talking like this is the time of Jane Austen, not the
Yeah.
time of Charles Dickens or Queen Victoria. We are properly the Bridgerton era of
very much
what's
so.
going on.
1804, we go back to Penydarren.
Yeah.
We here at the NRM, we had a rail fest in 2004 to celebrate the bicentenary of Trevithick and the Penydarren loco. And I personally ran the Trevithick engine for, well, it was meant to be 9 days, but the wheel fell off. So we lost a couple of days there. And yes, I do have film. We may show that a little bit later.
Do we want to talk about Jim Rees and the...
No, not today.
Okay, we won't
not
talk
today.
about that. Okay.
But hello, Jim, if you're watching. You'll probably tell me I've got half of this wrong, but bless you.
I'm sure there'll be that letter.
But just going back to the 1804, people were coming up to me and saying, well, where's the injector? And I said, well, it hasn't got one.
Yeah.
Where's the water pump? I said, well, it hasn't got one. How did they get the water in? I said, they forced it in against the boiler pressure because the boiler pressure was only 50 psi at the time. Well, why isn't it painted nicely? Why isn't it lined out? And I said, because there was nothing else like it.
No.
This really was it. And that improvement in 26 years, well, 25 years between 1804 and 1829, you look at that development, that is real cutting-edge white heat technology. And, we talk about the winner being Rocket, and there's that combination of the multitubular boiler, the directly coupled cylinders, and the blast pipe.
Yeah.
Whoever invented it. But the combination made it a world beater.
Yeah.
However, let's not forget, as I said, Braithwaite and Ericsson still sold a locomotive to the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, and the Liverpool-Manchester Railway then bought Samparai from Timothy Hackworth. It didn't win the trials, but it then went on to be a useful engine on the Bolton and Lee Railway, and arguably outlasted Rocket as a useful locomotive.
And Hackworth's son's going to go, Hackworth and his son are going to go on to arguably set up the first railway in Russia.
Yeah, they export the first locomotive to Russia, the first locomotive to Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
These again, they're good engineers. They're not so great as businessmen necessarily, but they're still there because there's nobody else doing it, and they're doing it well.
The comparison that always comes to my mind, I don't know if this is me showing my age in terms of references, that is like it's closest to early Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Where you've got people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, all these people who are competitors, are trying to set up these rival companies, but at the same time are talking to each other and looking at each other's stuff, because there are so few people who are doing doing what they're doing at
this
the time.
Is exactly it. And you think that Cherepanov, father and son, are sent from Russia to come and see locomotives at work in the UK, and they go and build an engine in 1834, which sort of does what they want it to do, but it still is for Hackworth to make that refinement and send the first commercially successful loco to Russia a couple of years later. Well, he sent it with his son, which is another cracking story. And perhaps that's a podcast for another time.
The Hackworth family archive is its own podcast.
And I think it's probably worth putting on the record here that folks do sometimes think that we belittle Hackworth.
No, not at all. No.
We don't, because we have that the Hackworth family archive. We have locomotion at Shildon as a museum, and it's there because that's where the Stockton and Darlington build their locomotive depot and workshops, and it's where Timothy Hackworth lives, builds Sampurae, and then makes this enormous, well, it's enormous, but this deeply successful locomotive fleet.
Yeah. I have one more figure.
Yeah.
And you know who he is because he's coming down the track, so I can barely restrain him. But before we get to him, because he's slightly, we're cheating a bit, he's slightly post-Rocket. Is there anyone else or anything else you were like, that's a story that must be told? There are
so many, and you can go through our library and our archive, and the names are there. You know, Nicholas Wood in his treatise on railroads. We won't necessarily go into him now, but there's him. There's Treadgold. There are various people writing treatises on railway networks pre-1820. You know, one of the books that we have, I forget the author immediately at the moment, but he talks about passenger trains, and the frontispiece in the book is an image of a Blenkinsop locomotive with stage carriages on railway wheels behind it, saying the railway can carry both goods and passengers. Remarkably prescient, really.
Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the things that we're involved in, the research societies like the Early Railway, you know, this is still, I'd like people to come over, please don't think this is a settled story.
No, absolutely not.
You know, because
no.
One of the problems is things like Railway 200, and I'm sure Rocket 200 and things will do the thing of canonising a particular version, but this is such a crazy, wonderful
the fact that
time period.
This year, as you and I have both worked on it, the 8th International Early Railways Conference, and we're looking forward to the 9th in 1829, 1830. There is so much still to come. This letter that's come in today, including Lancashire
things
Witch,
that come out of the woodwork that we didn't know existed,
and even things that we're finding in our archive even now. You know, there's a couple of manuscripts that came to the museum in 1898 that have come to light from South Kensington only recently and come up to us, talking about the boilers of Puffing Billy and Puffing Billy and Wylam Dilly. I really want to read those because, again, it's groundbreaking stuff. You know, we think we know the stories. We thought we knew the story of locomotion. Michael Bailey and Peter Davidson did their research on it. Now we do know the story of locomotion. And let's hope there's many more of those to come. But we want to talk about our fun friend who pushed boundaries, don't we?
I mean, he's the villain of the piece, right? So it's the sort of the panto.
We've got to get him in, haven't we?
Here he comes, steaming down the track.
Quite literally.
Quite literally. Who is Dionysius Lardner? Why is he so wonderfully named?
Well, it's a glorious name, isn't it?
Yeah.
Dr. Dionysius Lardner was one of those experts of
He's
the
like
time.
a polymath.
He was, you know, very much so.
And we're not talking about a stupid man here.
No. He wrote treatises, he wrote papers, he presented. Yeah. He was your man, like your scientific correspondent for BBC or whatever, you know.
And has a real passion for explaining, you know, new inventions, new scientific
finding
things,
out more as well.
Yeah, you know, writes things like universal dictionaries and encyclopedias and things.
And I say a polymath in a way that I don't think we necessarily can understand in the 21st century.
No, it's a very specific 19th century thing.
Yeah.
But he becomes fascinated with railways.
He does.
And comes into particular conflict with someone who's only come up peripherally so far, which is Brunel.
That's right. Well, you think about that, the railway as a new technology, and there's quite a lot of distrust about it. And there's all these stories that, you know, train running through tunnels, that people will get asphyxiated and hens will cease to lay, and you know, all
the sort of wave of trauma of
you
know, and we laugh about this and then think about when people have conversations about Hyperloop.
Yeah, or 5G and all that
5G
business about people saying that 5G would transmit the coronavirus and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it's not so far-fetched from where we are now.
No. So
Lardner.
Brunel.
I mean, it's lovely because Lardner, being the eminent scientist as he was at the time, got permission from the Great Western Railway to have an experimental train. Which
is that like a thing he's going to roll around in? Yeah. He's going to do measurements.
He's travelling the Great Western Railway, doing all sorts of things. Yeah. You know, and I mean, you know, he goes on to be a great exponent of the railway and write some really good stuff. But there's some lovely discourses, aren't there, between him and Brunel and the directors of the Great Western Railway.
Your favourite one about coming down the track.
Yeah, well, we're in the early days of railway signalling, aren't we? And double track main lines and all this sort of stuff. And there is this question where Lardner was asked about what would happen if you came across Mr. Brunel coming the other way with his train. And the phrase is, well, I would force him off the rails with my superior velocity. I mean, I wouldn't have liked to have been around to see if that had happened.
No, I think Brunel's very unimpressed.
That's
at the time,
it.
I think,
but amazing they put up with it.
Yeah.
But the reality is, nearly 200 years on, we do still have experimental trains on the railway. We've got Network Rail checking out tracks, checking out structures, measuring things, just in a bit more of a way where they fit in with the modern network.
And you feel because there's the famous biography of him that was a villain of steam, although actually it argues that he's not.
Yeah.
This is the reputation. He's always and apart from Dr. Richard Beeching.
Yeah.
He's the other railway. If you're the early railway,
it's
he's the other
love
railway
to hate him thing.
Man.
Yeah, but when you find out the full story behind him, about once he's got his knowledge, and we like to laugh at the figure of Lardner, but when you actually start to find out more into him and what he did, like Beeching, he was there to do a job. He was there to investigate. Okay, yeah, slightly maverick on occasions, but we have a safe railway network, and he's one name that we know about. There were a lot more vocal people around at the time and afterwards. As every development on the railway happened, people were there to be naysayers and try things out. And I think the fact that the railway system in 2025 is as safe and efficient and effective as it is.
And especially recent events earlier this year have demonstrated again.
Yeah.
But people I think get a bit sniffy about, it's the safest railway. What does that mean? But it's speaking to the current railway, they feel very passionate about being able to claim that.
Absolutely,
it's not it's not something you acquire without a lot of hard work. The idea of being the safest railway in the world.
That's the thing, and going back to those very early days, it was that almost courage to fail, and bounce back from the disasters. Trevithick went to the pub. That's one way of getting around it. Timothy Hackworth invented the spring safety valve. And that way, one thing leads to another. Collisions lead to signalling, warning systems. We end up or passenger comforts. The fact that you don't have refreshments on trains and corridors and loos. Look at us now. Each of those has come from something. Electric light on the train from those disasters. So many subjects for future podcasts, Ollie, but I think for today we've potentially run out of steam.
Literally, our experimental train is ground to a hole, I think.
Well, we haven't gone anywhere in the last hour looking out the window.
We did talk about having someone with a sort of revolving background.
It was done at the Paris Universal Exhibition with the Trans-Siberian.
Again, another potential podcast.
Absolutely.
One.
So thank you, Ollie.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for listening to that. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, please leave us a like or a comment below. If you don't subscribe to the channel, please subscribe. And if there are other topics you think you'd like to see get the sort of podcast treatment where we dive deep with an expert, please also let us know in the comments. Thanks.